Good evening. Welcome to the University of New England Center for Global Humanities. My name is Josh Pagan, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. We do have a change in schedule. Those of you who are already over at the Art Gallery may already know. Our speaker tonight, Kevin Cruz, who was supposed to lecture on One Nation Under God, unfortunately had to cancel. He came down very ill just today, and he is unable to make it. We're fortunate here at UNE, though. We have one of the world's best pinch hitters on staff. Many of you know our founding director of the center, our general manager of our campus in Tangier, our vice president for global affairs and communications, and I think he has a few more titles too that I probably just haven't been made aware of yet. Anouar is going to speak tonight, Anouar Majid, and he's going to present, I think, a topical lecture, a little bit casually maybe, about some of the world affairs going on currently, touching on Islam and immigration to the U.S. from Mexico and presidential politics. So without further ado, please welcome Anouar Majid.
Thank you. I'm apologize for the absence of our speaker. He and his family are sick, so it's a last-minute thing. And I know some of you made it here, so I'll try to share with you some of the things that I've been thinking about recently. It's not a formal speech. It's not a prepared speech, but and the idea for what to say occurred to me today at lunch at the Egg and I in Scarborough. I was having lunch with a friend of mine. You may know him, is Larry Rubenstein, and he came to the lunch meeting with this book in his hand. It's one of my books. It's called We Are All Moors, Ending Centuries of Crusade Against Muslim and Other Minorities, published in 2009. And he said he told me how perceptive the book was and anticipated the current discourse about immigrants, especially in light of this presidential campaign. And then so with that in mind, I said, okay, this may be a good thing to mention today and talk about a little bit, given the intensity of this presidential campaign. I published this book and I will also talk about other things that I wrote, especially Muslim and Arab American relations, to give this audience, to give you a broader sense of the history that gets occluded when people, especially politicians, are vying for public office. I wrote this book, We Are All Moors, in 2009. I published it in 2009 on the 400th anniversary of the decree to expel what used to be called in Spain the Moriscos from Spain. Moriscos, as you may recall, in 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, there was a year when the last bastion of Islam fell in Spain, Granada, the state of Granada, and so Catholics took over all of the Iberian Peninsula, or at least Spanish part of it, and the Jews were expelled from Spain, and they struck a deal with the Muslims who we had been in Spain for some 700 years. They struck a deal with them that they would allow them to keep their traditions and their culture and so on, and they gave them a lot of autonomy. Well, that deal was not. They reneged on that deal very quickly with the rise of the inquisitorial church attitudes, and then within a decade or so, pressure was mounting on the Muslims to convert to Catholicism, because in 1492, Spain had been divided into many kingdoms, and so King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella teamed up to try to unite Spain against one ideology, one faith, Catholicism, one language, Castilian. And so these two elements began to define the nation that is Spain. And so this nation had an other, who in this case which had been the Jew, now expelled from Spain in 1492, and then what had remained was the Moor, or at that time. And so the Moor came to define, the minority came to define what in essence was a Spanish nation, which is Catholic and speaks Spanish. The Moriscos many of them under pressure converted to Catholicism. But Spain, meanwhile, was increasingly embroiled in the New World. Not to forget, it was Spain that discovered, or at least that sent someone to discover this continent, Christopher Columbus. And so the empire was expanding. The pressure on Spain was getting more intense. And so the church was increasingly putting pressure on the Moors to convert to Catholicism. And they did, en masse, increasingly. But even when they did, they remained suspect in the eyes of the Spaniards, because the Spaniards had come up with a doctrine in the 15th century, in the 1400s, called limpieza de sangre, or the purity of blood, whereby even if you are a convert to Christianity, if you're a Jew or Muslim who had converted to Christianity, you are not Christian by blood, because Christianity doesn't go back biologically generations in the past. And you could see the relationship. In this book, I talk about the relationship between this very notion that Spain established in the 15th century and you can probably imagine it now, the racial policies of the Nazi regime. They were very interesting. You could see the pedigree. You could see the genealogical, intellectual, or cultural origin of some of the racist attitudes. Although they were of a different kind in the 20th century, you could make that relationship. So in any case, the Moors remained in Spain in a very precarious condition, under increasing pressure, and every time there was periodically a politician would, in that sense, he would be some sort of a high-ranking cleric, would put pressure on them and would appeal to the king to expel them. And meanwhile, again, they were using the same language they were using against the Moors in Spain towards the Native Americans whom they had encountered in the New World. So the Moor began to appear in two places, in Spain and the New World. Of course, Spain had issued many decrees to forbid the immigration of non-desirables. At that time, they were Lutherans, Protestants, and Jews and Muslims. So for the longest time, they were not allowed to immigrate to the New World. And so the Jews who had come here, and eventually the Muslims, they came in secrecy and maintained a secret identity. And for the Muslims, eventually, some of the first Muslims who came to the American continent were actually African slaves. But that's another discussion. But just to give you a little bit of a background on the things I'm going to come to. In any case, pressure was mounting on the Moriscos, and then till 1609. So finally, King Philip III decided to acquiesce to this political pressure and issue a decree to expel all the Moors, or Moriscos, Catholics of Muslim descent. And Islam is not a race, but you can imagine. Catholics of Muslim descent from Spain. So it was about approximately 3% of Spain's population. And so all the armed forces of Europe came together to undertake what ended up being a 5-year operation, to take them out of Spain, and some of the most productive segments of the Spanish population. And then, of course, the catastrophe were countless, the drownings, the persecutions, the horrors along the way, huge, some ended up in Turkey, some ended up in North Africa, some crossed the border into Spain. But you could see it was a massive undertaking. When I was writing this book, I was thinking of the question of immigration. At that time, the big discussion was what to do with the 20 million undocumented aliens in the United States, and and in Europe, what to do about this unassimilated Muslim population. So the book was a kind of a warning. Even though I'm celebrating, we are commemorating this tragic event, which had gone unnoticed for the most part. It's a warning to politicians today and how people define their identity. So I spent a lot of time talking about the notion of identity, national identity, what makes a nation, how the nation is construed, why it depends on excluding somebody else. You cannot have a group identity without having the other, or a sacrificial element, if you will. And so it's a complex phenomenon, but the first nation, in my view, in modern history, to create a nation state with all the structural elements that go into creating a nation, unified ideology, in that case, it would be Catholicism, unified language, Castilian, even though neither of these stuck in Spain till today. But they try to make it, and of course, in the process, racialize these components of the national identity. And the consequences were absolutely horrendous. The statue of the limpieza de sangre, of purity of faith, persisted all the way into the 19th century and only was taken away, eventually. It's only then that eventually Spain began to change its ways. Only recently did Spain acknowledge its injustice towards the Jews and invited them back and giving them citizenship after all this, about almost 500 years, more than 500 years. The Moriscos are still, the legend in Morocco I come from originally is that every Morisco still has a key in his house or her house to remind the Spaniards someday that they had been excluded, that had been expelled from Spain. The historical consequences of this expulsion was massive. It accounts for the rise of piracy in the Mediterranean and Atlantic seas, the maritime jihads against Christian vessels. I mean, all of that is, it's worth taking a look at this very interesting episode in history, which defined the rest of modern history. Because Spain, as I said, is the first nation to create. It's the first place or nation or country to create a modern sense of nationalism. So in this book, as I was looking about the history of immigration in the United States and how, for the longest time, many different populations were excluded, were seen as undesirables, basically. The nativist movement appeared in the middle of the 19th century, especially with the know-nothings who emerged to defend American identity, Protestant identity from intruders. And that had been, that pattern had continued all the way to the McCarthy era, in which race or religion, Catholicism, was replaced by ideology. In that case, would be communism. And so every generation or so sees the emergence of somebody who stands up to defend the purity of the nation against some perceived invader. It has been a pattern in American history, and no other country in the world, I think, had set up a committee, a congressional committee in the 1950s and 60s called the House Committee on Un-American Activities. There's no committee on un-French activities. There's no committee on un-Spanish activities. Only in the United States during the McCarthy era do we see such a thing. I marked a few pages that I wanted to read from, just to give you a sense of, some of the things I'm talking about. Especially striking, it makes me even wonder. It makes me wonder about whether some of the political candidates are associated with some of these movements. So in this case, violence against such human subjects, in Latinos and especially Mexicans, but all the people south of the American border, was no great offense. The war with Mexico and the atrocities committed against Mexicans were driven by this racist spirit, leading Ulysses Grant to admit that it was one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger nation, that it is against a weaker nation. Following the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe, which forced Mexico to cede huge parts of its land to the United States, Mexicans, as one might have predicted, became strangers in their own land and therefore easy targets for racist assaults. I remember I gave a talk last week in Maryland, and I recalled an episode I experienced in San Diego many years ago. It was soon It was in the late, maybe mid-90s or something. I was in Mexico for San Diego for a conference. I went to a sushi bar, and I was heartily welcomed by the patrons there. They were nice. We had a great conversation. And some of them started explaining to me why immigration is a big problem for California. And after they had asked where I was from, I told them Morocco. So they thought I was a tourist in California. So they tried to explain to me why Latino and Mexican immigration is basically bad. And I played the role. I played the role of a tourist, a naive tourist, and I asked the question. And I said, "Well, what's very interesting? Why does your city have a Spanish name?" And they looked at each other, didn't know what to say. And then I said, "How about San Francisco? And how about Los Angeles? And how about California itself?" And then they said, "Forget it." They went on another conversation. It's people forget. The evidence is obvious in front of our eyes. The names of the places, they're all Spanish. But then, people somehow, I don't know what it is. They have to have you do have to mental acrobatic act to forget that you are in a place that used to be Spanish. So in 1855, the Galveston Weekly News of Texas described a lynching in these terms. 11 Mexicans, it is stated, have been found along the Nueces in a hung-up condition. Better so than to be left on the ground for the following lobos to tear in pieces, and then howl the more for the red peppers that burn his insides raw. I'm quoting grammatical mistakes and all from this newspaper. Latinos are victims of racial violence every day. In 1990, Leonard Cohen, a 21-year-old white man, after drinking and popping pills, killed a 12-year-old Hispanic for fun and was sentenced to a mere 2 years in jail. The Anti-Defamation League has recently documented shocking amounts of violence against Mexicans and Hispanics, including video games by white supremacist groups that sometimes combine their hatred for non-whites with classic outbursts of anti-Semitism. In fact, the Southern Poverty Law Center, an organization that tracks hate groups in the United States, noted a significant surge of anti-immigrant nativist groups in the period 2005-2007, and the FBI reported increasing crimes against Latinos. Such groups' influence is so significant that by early 2008, just a year before this book was published, according to SPLC, 18 states' houses of representatives had passed resolutions opposing the North American Union, an entity encompassing Canada, the United States, and Mexico that does not exist and has never been planned, but nonetheless inhabits nativist nightmares. People think this is something that was happening. One more thing. And then in the United States, around the time they're talking about what to do with these Mexicans, simultaneously, in the United States, too, there has been talk of expelling Muslims. A New York Times report on a Christian blog provides a revealing glimpse into the fusion of deeply entrenched anti-Muslim biases and anti-immigrant resentment. On August 10, 2006, during the Israeli-Hezbollah war, bloggers wondered whether getting rid of Muslims from the United States might be the optimal solution to their nagging problem. I was keeping track of this blog and the discussion on this blog. So at 11:50 a.m., one blogger named Resting in Him opened the discussion by writing, "I know this is extreme, but am I wrong in thinking that we should close our borders to Muslims and evacuate a few who are already here? In fact, I'm wondering if all Muslim mosques, which are a haven for perpetrating hate against us, shouldn't be closed down." That afternoon, another blogger called Werner acknowledged that the war was indeed against Islam, but asked, "Have you thought through the logic of this? How many Muslims are American citizens? Should we force them to wear a little red crescent badge? If you can outlaw and deport Muslims, then you can do the same to any religion of faith. That the way to defeat Islam is to share with them the gospel." After some debate as to whether such removals would be constitutional, one old Shasti wrote at 8:59 p.m. now, at the end of the day, "No one is suggesting they be subjected to the horrors of concentration camp or beaten or arrested on sight. But what would be wrong with at least an immediate cessation of all incoming Muslims, Arabs, and perhaps a watch list or even eventual deportation of those in the country?" About an hour later, Living for Him revealed the twin motive in the anti-immigration movement. "My daughter works at 7-Eleven at a 7-Eleven store, and her boss is a Muslim, and he's not exactly the nicest person to work for. We just haven't had any good experiences with them. Thus, in the course of one day's blogging, the reasons for anti-Muslim bias shifted from politics and religion to typical resentment of the immigrants' economic success. And so you could see the discourse that you hear today has been here for a while. It's, I mean, it's heavily, in some places in the book, it's quite heavily documented to show this relationship between the fusion. Samuel Huntington, the author of the great, the political scientist who died some time ago, he himself combined the fear of immigration with the fear of Islam. So they were always seen one sort of related, closely related. They're not exactly the same. And of course, Latinos played a role in doing some of this too. Some of them, some progressive Latinos, or some, like even Fidel Castro himself once claimed descent from the Moors. They usually see themselves, because they're alienated in their societies, they claim that kind of heritage. But it's an interesting relationship. The discourse I'm hearing today it's not new. In fact, it's almost repeated verbatim sometimes. And for some people, it's shocking. But for people who have paid a close look at the history of immigration in the United States, especially in the 19th and 20th century, you could easily identify, you could just see as part of a longer pattern in American culture. So this is in relation to this book. And I have, my last book is called Islam and America, Building a Future Without Prejudice. And in that book, I reflect a little bit about what's positive about American Arab or American Muslim relations. And it's easy to forget now. In fact, if I were to ask a lot of people in this audience, what is it, if they are aware of any, if they're aware of this relationship, what are the aspects or features of this relationship, probably very few would know. But it's an interesting history. And it gets complicated because sometimes people use the word Arab, and sometimes people use the word Muslim. And we can discuss that. It's that Arabs are not Arabs are not all Muslim, and not all Muslim are Arabs. So, but there's enough overlapping, and that they get easily, they pass for each other sometimes. So, in the beginning, when the United States was established, when America was colonized by European pilgrims, especially English-speaking pilgrims, they brought with them the biases of Europe regarding Islam. Islam had been a threat to Christendom in Europe for the longest, since Islam emerged on the global scene in the 7th century. And so those biases came with the pilgrims, and you can find a literature that is documented in my last book about that, what the preachers were saying. So again, every time you hear a preacher saying negative things about Islam, do not think it's something that's new. It's been here for a while. It is inherited from a legacy. Many of these people who are speaking today, they don't realize maybe that legacy is older than they think, but it has been there. Islam has always been. During the American Revolution, the founders, some of them accused each other of being Muslim because they associated Islam with despotism. And the looming threat at that time was the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. And so the Janissaries were seen as a very despotic thing. The first war of the United States besides after the American Revolution, the success of the American Revolution was with Muslim corsairs in the Mediterranean. That's the reason why Jefferson pushed for the establishment of a U.S. Navy. The Navy was established to fight corsairs who are impeding the safe traffic of American vessels, or any vessel, into the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was a significant part of the commercial enterprise of the United States. And so this, Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis exacted tribute from any entering ships, especially if they were Christian, and the Europeans gladly paid those tribute, but the Americans, emerging out of a revolution, were kind of offended to have to pay a bunch of basically barbarians and thugs a tribute to do business in the Mediterranean. Eventually, but these countries took captured the vessels and kept a lot of Americans captive. Eventually, they had to be ransomed. And in some cases, the story was totally amazing. I think there's a forthcoming movie about one of these episodes about James Riley and his ship that was shipwrecked in the south of Morocco, 1815, and what happened to him was an incredible story, influenced Abraham Lincoln, but we won't talk about it now. But in that, during one of these episodes, when the United States was negotiating, let's say, with the Tripolitans, who are now the Libyans, in one of the peace treaty they made with them, they said the United States is in no way a Christian nation. They were coming to make the negotiating not as Christians, they were assuring the Muslims, but as Americans. And it is a line that was used early on during the Obama administration, I think by Obama himself or by one of his aides when he was initially speaking in Cairo or before that in Istanbul and other places. In one of these episodes, he mentions this statement was resurrected to assure the Arabs and Muslims that the United States is not addressing them as a Christian nation, but as a secular one. And of course, the source of Tripoli, the Marines hymn is now reminds us of this painful episode, which eventually, and even the national anthem of the United States was based. Francis Scott Key's national anthem composition was based on a previous one that celebrated the defeat of the Tripolitans. It's composed of the same music, and the lyrics are almost exactly. I mean, they sound the same. I can read it to you, but. It's fascinating. There's aspects of this relationship that have shaped American history that are not very well known. And then the relationship, continues in different ways until with the Civil War, for example, the United States, because of the war with the South, which was a cotton-producing region, they allowed Egypt to prosper. Egypt was a cotton-producing nation, and then, of course, they created a lot of wealth. After the Civil War, the United States, the Khedive Ismail of Egypt, who was the leader of Egypt, he recruited American Civil War veterans from both sides, North and South, to come and establish a modern Egyptian army. It was the first time an Arab and Muslim nation did so. And so when they came, they introduced literacy and discipline. They really, in a very short period of time, undertook huge works and projects that were remarkable. The successor to Khedive Ismail, which is Khedive Tawfiq, was so impressed by America that he wanted to model Egypt on the United States. And this is the beginning of a love relationship that is not really known. Around the same time, there's a Maynard. I know some of his relatives, Cyrus Hamlin, who studied at Bowdoin, and he was a missionary, ends up in Istanbul in Turkey, to establish the first American college in the Middle East, Robert College. And now that college became so influential over time, produced, graduated a lot of leaders in Turkey who eventually had a huge say and shaped the destiny of that nation. Not long after that, he established a women's college in Turkey. Daniel Bliss, meanwhile, was roaming around in Beirut, and he decided a missionary. Missionaries were flocking to the Middle East because they wanted to take with them the new brand of Christianity, Protestantism, but they run against huge hurdles. Very, very few people wanted to convert. Muslims definitely were just impossible to convert. The occasional Maronite or the occasional Greek Orthodox, but then the Greek Orthodox and the Maronites and others resisted fiercely this presumptuous Americans who are bringing with them their new brand of Christianity, reminding them periodically that Christianity was born there and not here. And but anyway, it was a very remarkable and epic undertaking by American missionaries. But when they realized it's going to be an impossible task, they switched to social works and they began to do amazing things. So this Daniel Bliss was one of them. He established the Syrian Protestant College, which eventually became the American University of Beirut. It is the most influential, has been, still is the most influential university in the Middle East. In the 20th century, I think in 1919 or around that time, Charles Watson, another missionary who fell out, had a falling out with his church, established the American University in Cairo. And I'm going to read to you some of the work these people have did. According to Michael Orr in his book, the Faith and Power. In the single decade between 1885 and 1895, the budget for missionary institutions in the Middle East expanded sevenfold. In addition to over 400 schools and 9 colleges with a total enrollment of 20,000, the money also paid for 9 hospitals and 10 dispensaries, treating an estimated 40,000 patients annually. Along with journals, newspapers, and Bibles in 5 Middle Eastern languages, American presses rolled out some 4 million textbooks on topics ranging from astronomy to dentistry, lithography, to moral philosophy. Michael Field, if I can find it here, Michael, one of the great scholar of this whole period in American history, he wrote, the Americans had set out across the world to teach the word of God, Quite without intention, as T. Lawrence was to observe, they taught revolution. And it is this part of the American history in the Middle East, again, that is not very well known. Around the turn of the century, Syrians, that they were called then Syrians, began to immigrate to the United States. And so you begin to see an emerging literature from the Middle East produced and published in the United States. One of the first ones is Reverend Abraham Rihbani, who published a book called A Far Journey in 1917. And around this time, this writer began to see the United States as a very developed nation, industrial nation, powerful, logical, Cartesian, and they used to see the Middle East, as a place of spirituality and meditation and poetry. So that's the distinction they used to make in their minds of the differences between the United States or the West as a whole and the Middle East. Then you have Amin Rihani, who died in 1948. He was a Maronite. He was technically the first Arab American writer, that is a fiction writer. He was heavily influenced by Whitman and by a medieval Muslim philosopher and poet by the name of Al-Ma'arri. He is always very often accused of atheism, and very wonderful person. He wrote a book called The Book of Khalid in 1911, and he traces the tortuous journey of this man who straddles East and West. But here he comes to a conclusion that I want to read you from some parts of the book, not conclusion, but a description of how this person, after Amin Rihani, like others, were not enthralled by the excessive materialism, they saw in the United States, but on the other hand, they had high hopes for the United States to become a shining beacon upon the hill, if you will, and so influenced by this mix of traditions, Amin Rihani would write a poem that goes, parts of which go, no crescent, no cross we adore, no Buddha, no Christ we implore, no Muslim, no Jew we abhor. We are free. We are not of Iran or of Ind. We are not of Arabia or of Sind. We are free. We are not of the East of the West. We are not of the East of the West. No boundaries exist in our breast. We are free. And then of course, after he comes to terms with the United States and what it is now and what it could be in the future, he writes, to this United States shall the nations of the world turn one day for the best model of good government. In this United States, the well springs of the higher aspirations of the soul shall quench the thirst of every race traveler on the highway of emancipation. And from these United States, the sun and moon of a great faith and a great art shall rise upon mankind. And in a different place, talking about the American Superman, clearly influenced here by Whitman, From his transcendental height, the Superman of America shall ray forth in every direction the divine light, which shall mellow and purify the spirit of nations and strengthen and sweeten the spirit of men in the new world. I tell you, he shall be born, but he shall not be an American in the democratic sense. He shall be nor of the old world, nor of the new. He shall be my brothers of both. In him shall be reincarnated the Asiatic spirit of origination, of poesy and prophecy, and the European spirit of art, and the American spirit of invention. The nation that leads the world today in material progress shall lead it too in the future in the higher things of the mind and soul. And this, his views, and he even dreamt of a United Arab States. The Reverend Rihbani too agreed with him in this sense, and because he wanted to dissociate himself and the Arab nations from the Ottomans, who are Turkish. In 1919, an American commission was sent to the Middle East to poll the population to see whether they stand in relation to the superpowers of Europe, namely Britain and France. And they traveled from, it's called the King Crane Commission. They traveled from Turkey to Iran, and the unanimous sentiment in this area was they wanted an American mandate on them. But the Congress rejected that recommendation. They didn't want to go for it. George Antonius, who the author of The Arab Awakening, it is the manifesto of Arab nationalism. He recognizes the United States as the foster parent of Arab nationalism. And he's right, because a lot of this literature that the universities and the presses that the Americans introduced in the Middle East created a new person known as the Arab. Salom, and then there are other Americans that I should mention, just so we can recall, if you can. I wrote some of their names, but I'll mention some names here. One of them is Khalil Gibran, as you know, author of The Prophet, published in the 1920s. It's a very influential book, had a lifelong sort of influence on people like Elvis Presley and others. But there's a Khalil Gibran Day in Boston now because that's where he lived. Very influential writer. You may never have heard of, some of you may have heard of him, but he's the author of a very famous book called The Prophet. And then there, of course, are people who participated in a variety of fields in American culture and society. You have people like Salom Rose, Dr. Anthony Shadid, Michael Shadid, I'm sorry. He practiced in Oklahoma. He is an immigrant from Lebanon, and he started the first medical cooperative in that state. The first, basically, universal health insurance policy that had been created in the United States. For $25, a family of four can get medical care for the whole year. He wrote a book about it, and I have an article on my magazine on the website. You can find it. It's a fascinating story. I later discovered that he was related to the journalist Anthony Shadid, if you remember him. He's a New York Times journalist who died on the Syrian-Turkish border just after after the trouble started in Syria. He died of an asthma attack. I used to read his articles frequently. He was a major reporter. He was a reporter in the Middle East. And I sent him an email. I said, are you by any chance related to Dr. Michael Shadid? He said, yes, he's a cousin. And I'm collecting my papers to write on him, to do something on him. A week later, he died. And I wrote about that episode, which was carried in some Oklahoma newspaper and so on and so forth. So there are these relationships that people don't seem to be aware of. There's also, one of the greatest philanthropists in the field of medicine is Danny Thomas. You probably know his daughter. She's very famous. He was an aspiring actor. He was born in Michigan. His name was Yakub. And then he wanted to be a successful actor. And one day, down on his luck, he prays to the patron saint of lost causes, Saint Jude, and he prays that if he gets successful, he'll do something to repay for what he gets. And when he became successful, he and a bunch of other Americans established St. Jude's Hospital, which is now the world's premier hospital in catastrophic illnesses in children. And I know I had some contact with the hospital for personal reasons, but it's an interesting story that people don't People do not seem to make the connection between St. Jude and this history of Arab immigration to America. There is also Debakey, a heart surgeon, a very revolutionized heart surgery. He practiced in Louisiana. He was born in Louisiana. He got many, many medals. And both, by the way, Danny Thomas and Debakey, I think it's Michael Debakey, Dr. Michael Debakey, they get presidential medals, and Danny Thomas was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, but he didn't get it. So it's a And then, of course, there are politicians, there are actors, there are all kinds of people who have played an incredible role. The only person who had a hard time in the United States, apparently, is Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb, the guru or the mastermind of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. He came here to the United States on a scholarship to study the American educational system. He came here in 1948, left in 1950, just at the time when Israel was founded and the United States, which a project that the United States supported. And he went back to Egypt and he wrote an article called The America I Have Seen, published in 1951. And in that article, he talks about how the rampant materialism in the United States, how the churches have seeded the spirit, have become empty spaces where people are more interested in bingo than in spiritual experiences. He had a very negative view of the United States. He of course, he acknowledged the technology and the science and so on, but he thought it was a spiritually empty place. And at this time, he was not a fundamentalist. He goes back to Egypt, and then he gets involved in this, in this movement. Of course, he's jailed in Egypt, and then he writes the books that eventually become the Bible of the Muslim Brothers, and now, of course, the handbooks for all Muslim fundamentalists and extremists. So it's surprising. He only spent 2 years here. He didn't have good things to say. But people who had spent a lifetime here and they made their lives here admired and loved the United States. But I have to say, though, that most of these people I mentioned were Christians, were from Christian backgrounds, Maronite, Greek Orthodox, you name it. It's only after the immigration patterns of 1965 that when immigration law changed and we began to get an influx of more Muslims, people of Muslim descent coming to the United States. And for the longest time, they fit more or less in the same patterns because Christians and Muslims see themselves as part of a sort of Arab Islamic culture, regardless of faith. This history, this memory, has been totally eclipsed in the last few decades with the rise of Islamic extremism and fundamentalism, and the wars that are continually going on in the Middle East. Now, the American relationship with the Middle East changed dramatically for two reasons in the 20th century. One is the power of oil, and the other one is the establishment of the State of Israel, and so that sort of that led to a very conflicted relationship that hasn't been fully solved or addressed until today. And I think, I'm hoping that sooner or later, the politics of oil and a solid and durable peace process between Palestinians and the Israelis will eventually take care of this. So I mentioned these episodes as I mentioned this in the context of this presidential election. I'm not so sure what you're going to make of this information. It's something that really occurred to me today to mention, but I think it gives us some background, some historical background, at least allows us to make sense of this conflicting narratives and disturbing narratives sometimes that people are using without any knowledge, without any true understanding of the situation, or especially the historical one. Now, it doesn't mean that relationships are not bad, that Islam and Muslims are doing very bad things, and we should be very careful and we should be very vigilant about defending the American Revolution that had been defended by a lot of these writers, and they admiringly. But I would hope that we have a nuanced understanding of history to allow us to come up with policies and solutions that have a better chance of succeeding. I'll stop here and see what kinds of questions you have. And I'm not Kevin Cruz.
Let's open it up to some questions now for Anouar. We'll start right down in front. Here you go, ma'am.
I agree with everything you said, but that's probably because I'm a first-generation American Muslim. And I see the discourse and the communication that goes between political speakers and their audience when they go to town halls and everything, that there is such an, and I want to say ignorance, I don't mean that in a bad way, and I mean it in the sense that Americans don't have a true understanding of Islam and the people. I mean, how many people have met a Palestinian? How many people have met a Syrian from Syria? How many people have met? So I think, we need to start with basics in educating each other, and myself included, as far as other cultures and other people. How do we do that? How do we do that? Aside from the fact that we should treat each other as equals, as human beings. How do we do that?
Yeah. How do we, I think personally, I come from a humanities tradition, a literary tradition, so I think self-criticism is always a good thing. We fall into, it's very tempting to fall into a false sense of identity. I would hope that we come to a time, at least discursively, or a place that's discursively, when every time you feel tempted to say, you fill in the blanks. I am American, I'm Canadian, I'm Mexican, I am Christian. Pause and rethink that assumption. Because the moment you make a statement like that, you immediately exclude a whole bunch of people, and it's a very one-dimensional and simplistic statement. For example, you say, "What is a Mexican?" I don't, to define a Mexican, we need volumes to define a Mexican. Mexicans all complain about the imperialist Yankee, but a lot of Mexicans look down on the Native Americans there. They treat them as serfs in their midst. There's no unified national identity. I've always said, politicians stand up and say the American people want. I say that's the biggest fiction I ever heard. There's no such thing as the American people. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as a Palestinian. There's no such thing as, we say them because otherwise we'll never be able to say anything. But at least if we begin to think about the assumptions we make, because they're exclusionary assumptions. Whenever you say, I'm American, you're automatically saying that we are not Canadian. And a lot of people don't like Canada for some reason, but Canada is right there. But it's one of those things. Identity always plays on the negative. I am me because I am not you. I can only be me because I am not you. Otherwise, I won't be me. And so we need to change this equation, this formula, and see if we can rectify it by using another language, or at least rethinking and never resisting the temptation to define ourselves in simple terms. So when you say is Palestine, when I say, a national identity or religious identity is so complex, especially an ethnic identity in Arab, it's all very extremely complex, but we use them for convenience, and then we suffer the consequences.
Another question right here.
I wanted to know if you knew of a Muslim group in America that works for the separation of church and state. Their name sounds something like Amadeus,
Okay.
but I can't. I have some notes, but I do not have them with me. I can't remember anything more than that. I just heard a talk on the radio about the other day.
And that's a great idea. This group needs a lot of support and encouragement. You know, the notion of separation of state and church, it's not an Islamic one. I mean, it's not in the Islamic theology. So, and so we need to have them, we need to move, you need to make a break, some sort of rupture with the Islamic faith. And that's what a lot of Muslims are having a very difficult time doing, because, you know, they're totally governed by the belief system. And so in their minds, the sovereignty of God is supreme. You know, what God says in the Quran is indisputable. And the dictates in the Quran are the things that people should live by. And so it is a very tough case. As you know, the separation of state and church, the United States intervened militarily in Iraq and Afghanistan after and they sent even legal experts to help them draft constitutions, and they couldn't do it. You know, Noah Feldman, who was an observing Jew, but a formidable legal expert, constitutional scholar, just shrugged and said, you know, this is the best we can do. We cannot avoid saying Islam is the official religion of the state. And the president of Iraq and the president of Afghanistan need to be Muslim by law. Otherwise, people would not accept this constitution. So a cultural revolution in the Middle East and among Muslims is absolutely indispensable. It's needed. It needs to be supported unapologetically by the powers that be. We should not be tiptoeing around the issue. It is a major, everything, you know, our civilization is in some ways at stake if we don't encourage people in that part of the world to rethink and to move forward, to embrace another model of government and citizenship. Well, he mentioned, I don't know who it is, no.
A question right here.
I think it's at the very least helpful, if you're going to talk about immigration, to distinguish between humanitarian concerns. You mentioned Mexico, and political and economic distinctions, religious differences. With the Mexican situation, I think, just speaking in generalities, there's a big difference between our concerns with the Mexican-U.S. border and our immigration policies with regard to Muslims. We are, people in the Southwest are living daily with having to turn away very, very poor people who have come to, you know, God bless America, seeking opportunities or seeking to be reunited with families. We have, through NAFTA, opened more trade routes between our countries. We have at the same time, and not for totally protectionist reasons. I mean, there are some ugly things going on at the border and on both sides of the border. But we are faced daily with a huge humanitarian crisis there. And I think when people think about immigration policy, there is for many of us that humanitarian divide. So I think it's at least helpful to acknowledge that we're dealing with a couple of different arenas there. It's just not one, it's immigration concerns don't just fall along one cultural or nationalistic line.
That's right. You're right. I mean, no two situations are alike. And, but when I was writing this book, I think it was during the, I was looking at the time during the Bush administration, you know, and who was in office. There were a few Hispanics, and it's interesting that you could see the beginnings of the emergence of Latin-sounding or Spanish-sounding names who have positions of leadership in politics. And I don't know how many years later now, 7 years later, now we are watching, and it doesn't occur to us that the two presidential candidates are Hispanic, Ted Cruz and Mark Rubio. What is it, Rubio? And these are people who come out of the immigration process, and there were times when their parents or their grandparents would have seen as intruders and invaders of the man, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying, I'm not making a case for free immigration or for liberal immigration policies. That's up to the politicians and up to you. But I'm saying is keep it in mind. And again, the discourse that the keepers of the purity of the nation have used through centuries. The 19th century, where it was the Catholics, they burned Catholic churches and so on because they were afraid of Catholics taking over this land. And still, I don't know, maybe that fear of Catholicism subsided over time. But there's always an other that has loomed large in the defender's imagination, who poses a threat to the American fabric. But the discourse on Latin America from the 19th century on was almost all negative. They were seen as degraded races. They were kind of combination of lazy Spaniards and Native American peoples. You could see there's a lot of racial elements that go eventually that get sublimated or that's into some other language. But there's a persistent pattern of looking at Latinos and Mexicans in a negative way. You'll be hard-pressed to find examples when that's not the case. And so, yes, you defend your border, but we also have to pay attention to the other things that may play a role in our political imagination. One more question or no?
Well, maybe we'll leave it there for... Oh, we have another question right here. Sorry. Jumping the gun. Here you go, sir.
So I was interested, you talked about in this, I think it was 1609, thereabouts, how the Muslims were given a lot of autonomy. Did that turn into the idea of the autonomy that they live by their own rules and laws? Because I know there's a concern as we bring people into, I know that some European countries are concerning, you have to assimilate.
Yeah.
But somehow to assimilate without losing your identification. And is there, I know there's some other blocks where, you're in this such and such block, you have to live by such and such rules within this block, which are different than the countries. Can you talk a little bit about maybe that's a fear here in our country that we'll lose our country's identity without assimilation? Or how do you assimilate without losing your own identity or your own culture?
Yes. Again, when I was writing this book, that I mentioned, We Are All Moors, I looked at, keep this in mind. I looked at the statistics and even police reports in France about how many people are radicalized Muslims and what's out of a population of 5 or 6 million Muslims. It's a fraction. It's a fraction. And how many people even wear the hijab, the veil? It's a fraction. But these people, if you look at the media, you get the impression that everybody is wearing the hijab and everybody has a beard and everybody is doing the same thing and so on. But the vast majority, this is from intelligence services in France, the vast majority of people are mostly French, if not French, fully French. And you could see that same example unfolding today. The acts of terrorism that happened in France and Brussels in the last few months. There are about a maximum of 30 people involved. From one neighborhood, probably, they've caused massive havoc in Europe. And there's a small little clique of guys between the ages of 20 and 30. You get the impression, it's very tempting to see that, oh my gosh, all the Muslims are doing this, but it's not true. It's not the case. But on the other hand, having said that, Islam, the Muslim societies and Islam itself, it's in need of a revision and reform because for other reasons, for some of these reasons, but also for other reasons. So, again, we need to have a nuanced approach to the situation. Yes, it is very contained, it is very restricted, but on the other hand, is Muslim majority nations, do they need reform? Yes. In my view, they're all failed societies. In every index of human development, every level, education, health, research and development, reading and literacy, all of those, they are far behind their peer nations, not to mention developed nations in the West. So it's a struggle. They are trapped in a culture that they need to break away from, and we need to help them do that because, it's a serious problem. It's a serious problem. So I am for the separation of state and church. I am, in fact, for the wholesale revision of all religions. To me, they're antiquated modes of thinking and governing and relating to the modern world. But since we have them, at least we need to find ways to make sure that they don't intrude too heavily and complicate our lives in the modern world.
Well, okay, I guess we'll leave it.
Thank you.
Leave it there. Please give it a round of applause.